"Welcome to our city, Mr. Harrison," the heavy-set woman gushed. "Preston here has told us such marvelous things about you. We all miss Bob Allen, of course, but we're so excited to have you succeed him at the United Fund." "You're very kind to say so," Carter Harrison responded. "Bob is leaving behind some awfully big shoes to fill, but I'm looking forward to the challenge." Preston Charlton, the president of the bank hosting the reception, beamed happily as he skillfully guided his guest of honor around to meet other invitees. He had headed the search committee that found Harrison, and now that the United Fund's full board of trustees had ratified the committee's recommendation, Preston was eager to show off his find. The reception room was filled with a mix of local business leaders, city politicos, and representatives from the various charitable agencies that received grants from the United Fund. The mood was convivial. A little free booze and some high-quality hors d'oeuvres were just the thing to ensure a warm welcome for the new man, Charlton thought. "Who's the tall fellow chatting with the mayor?" Harrison asked. "And who's the attractive woman with them?" Charlton looked around to see where Carter Harrison was indicating, and a smile came to his face. "Oh, that's Father McClanahan, the priest at St. Anne's. The woman is Colleen O'Reilly. She's the director of one of your member agencies, the Second Chance Women's Shelter. She's also Father Mac's wife. You've got to meet them." Carter's face took on a puzzled expression. "A priest with a wife? Oh, sorry. I should have said St. Anne's Episcopal Church. And before you ask about the difference in names, Colleen kept her maiden name when they married." Harrison's face remained skeptical. "And why is it so important that I meet Father McClanahan?" he asked. Charlton smiled. "Father Mac is one of the most influential men in town." "Oh, really?" Harrison replied. "I wouldn't have thought a priest would have that much influence, except on spiritual matters, of course. What makes McClanahan so special?" "It's hard to say, but he's just one of the most decent people you'll ever meet. Everybody likes and trusts him, and everybody goes to him for counsel and advice, and not just members of his parish either." "Well, let's go meet this paragon priest," Harrison said. Hearing an odd tone in Harrison's voice, Charlton glanced quickly at the shorter man, but Harrison had a smile on his face. So, Charlton led his honored guest over to the couple. "Colleen, Father Mac, I'd like to introduce you to Carter Harrison, the new executive director of the United Fund," Charlton said heartily. Once the introductions were made all around, Father Mac smiled at Harrison. "Preston tells us that before you entered the nonprofit sector, you had quite a career at Procter & Gamble. Has that experience been valuable in working with the United Fund?" Harrison didn't hesitate. "The private sector all too often focuses on short-term gain to the detriment of long-term goals, but its emphasis on measurable results is something I've found very useful when working with charities. You'll find that I'm a very results-oriented individual." Then he turned to Colleen. "One of the techniques I've used very successfully is to establish small interagency task forces to tackle some of the issues that communities face. Miss O'Reilly, Preston here tells me that you're one of the most energetic and successful agency heads in the city. Perhaps I could persuade you to lead one of those task forces?" Colleen blushed at the unexpected compliment. "I'd be honored, Carter. That sounds like a great idea." After the reception, when Mac and Colleen had returned to the parsonage, he teased her about her blush. "Well, we learned one thing about Carter Harrison. He knows how to make a good first impression, at least on some agency heads." Colleen blushed again. "Well, I know a certain husband who could take a few lessons on paying compliments to his wife," she said with a playful grin. "Are you talking about the husband with the most beautiful wife at the reception tonight?" he asked with a smile. When Colleen grinned at him, he continued, "See, I may not be the smoothest husband, but at least I'm teachable." With that, he reached for his wife, who laughed as she playfully dodged his grasp and ran into the bedroom, making sure he was close behind. A couple of months later, Father Mac had lunch with Bob Allen. He hadn't seen his old friend since the former United Fund executive had retired, and he wanted to find out how the man was enjoying his new life. When they had finished their meal and the waitress brought them coffee, Allen looked at Father Mac with appreciation. "I'm glad you wanted to get together, Father Mac. One of the things I miss most in retirement is not meeting with people as often as I used to. Once you're out of the game, people tend to think you don't have anything of value to contribute anymore." "I'm surprised to hear that, Bob. I know for a fact that your old team holds you in high regard. I would think they'd still come to you for your opinion and advice." Allen's face took on a resigned expression. "You're kind to say that, Father Mac, and maybe some of them would. But I've gotten the sense that the new man in charge wants to cut ties with the past. After one of the team called to ask me a question, I heard that Harrison chewed her out and told her to check with him before she called me again." Father Mac's brows furrowed. "That doesn't sound like a very helpful attitude to take," he said mildly. Allen brushed it aside. "It's probably for the best. The new guy has his own agenda and wants to do things his own way. Calling an old fart like me just slows down the transition." Father Mac smiled at him. "You're hardly an old fart, Bob. Besides, you know more about the United Fund than anybody else around." The two finished their lunch and agreed to stay in touch. Later, as he returned to his little office at St. Anne's, Father Mac kept thinking about Bob Allen's comments. "I think I'll check in with Preston and get his take on how Harrison is doing." Charlton's secretary was a member of Father Mac's congregation, and she was happy to put her priest straight through to the bank president. "What can I do for you, Father Mac?" Charlton said warmly. "I hope you're not calling to scold me because I missed Mass last Sunday." Father Mac laughed. "If I had to scold everyone who ever missed a service, I wouldn't have time for anything else. No, I just thought I'd touch base with you about our new United Fund exec and see how he's working out." "He's doing great!" Charlton exclaimed immediately. "He's already been calling on major donors and has gotten a number of them to agree to an increase, even before the campaign begins. That fellow is a go-getter. I think we've found a real winner." "That's great news, Preston," Father Mac responded. "I was a big fan of Bob Allen, and when he left, I was worried that we'd have a hard time finding a suitable successor. But it sounds like you've done really well for us." The call with Preston reassured Father Mac, and he decided that his earlier concerns had been unnecessary. Accordingly, when he went by the United Fund office a week later to meet with one of the account executives, he had largely forgotten his earlier unease. On his way back to Bill Simpson's cubicle, he passed Marge Terrell's desk and gave her a friendly wave. "How's my favorite bookkeeper today?" he asked pleasantly. He had actually never been formally introduced to the older lady, but she had been a fixture at the United Fund for years and always had a smile and a warm greeting for the priest. When he reached Bill Simpson's desk, the two men began to talk about the homeless audit they hoped to conduct in the coming months. Working with the homeless was an area of special interest for Father Mac, and St. Anne's regularly conducted clothing drives and operated a soup kitchen to help them. After they finished their discussion, Bill asked Father Mac not to leave right away. "Have you got time to get a cup of coffee with me in the break room, Father Mac? There's something else I'd like to discuss with you." Something in the way the man asked caught Mac's attention, and he quickly agreed. When they reached the break room, Bill looked in to make sure it was empty and then poured cups of coffee for the priest and himself. Once they were seated, Father Mac asked, "So, what did you want to talk about, Bill? Is everything okay?" The young man glanced around furtively and then said in a low voice, "Not really, Father Mac. Actually, I'm thinking about leaving the United Fund. This place has changed, and not for the better." Father Mac frowned and lowered his voice as well. "I'm sorry to hear that. What's the problem, Bill? What's going on?" "It's him, Father Mac. The new boss," he said conspiratorially. he's a real micromanager. He's got everybody looking over their shoulders, scared he's going to chew us out for not doing things exactly the way he wants them done, Bill said, his frustration clear. Father Mac gave a small shrug. We both know Bob Allen was pretty easygoing when he was here, Bill. Are you sure this isn't just a case of Harrison trying to tighten things up a little? Simpson shook his head emphatically. It goes way beyond running a tight ship. The man's a petty tyrant. Everything has to be done his way, on his time. If it isn't, he makes sure you and everyone else know about it. He leaned closer to the priest. He's already run off a couple of people, and there are others besides me who are thinking about leaving. I've been here 8 years and want to stay, but I don't know how much longer I can stick it out. Father Mac shook his head. That's very disturbing news, Bill. I had no idea things were that bad. Simpson gestured to make his point. I know what the problem is, Father. He's got short man syndrome. He's like a chihuahua, always barking at the top of his lungs because he wants everyone to see how fierce he is. He abruptly checked his wristwatch. My break time's almost up, Father Mac. I've got to get back to my desk, or I'll catch hell for being late. No offense. I'll walk back with you, Bill, the priest told him as he stood to leave. Please keep me posted, and don't do anything hasty, okay? The conversation left Father Mac troubled, and he frowned as he made his way toward the entrance. Looking up, he was startled to see the very person they had just been discussing. The United Fund executive approached him quickly. Well, Father Mac, Harrison said in a hearty tone that felt insincere to the priest, what a surprise to see you here. Are you conducting a surprise inspection? The aggressive tone caught Father Mac off guard, and he responded defensively. No, Carter, not at all. I've just been working with one of your team members on the homeless issue. I came by to get some information from him, that's all. I've got the latest homeless data in my office, Harrison said curtly. Come this way. Father Mac felt he had no choice but to comply, so he followed the man, feeling weary. Once in the office, Harrison handed him a file and looked at him closely. I hear you've been checking up on me, Harrison said. If you have any concerns about my work, you should come to me directly, Father. No, Carter, I haven't been checking up on you, Father Mac said uncomfortably. The United Fund is important to this community, and I just wanted to see how it's going under the new leadership. I appreciate the interest, Father, but I think you'll find the organization is doing very well. From now on, if you need further information, come to me, and I'll handle it. Sure, Carter, sure, Father Mac said quickly. I'll do just that. Then, he turned and made his way out of the building, wondering at the prickly reception. What did I do to get under his skin like that? He asked himself. He was still unsettled by the encounter when Colleen got home from work that evening. When she mentioned she'd spent part of the afternoon working with Harrison's task force, his ears perked up. Tell me, he asked his wife casually, what's your take on Carter Harrison? How do you find him to work with? Honestly, she began, he's a breath of fresh air. Usually, United Fund Committee meetings drag on forever and never accomplish anything. We've had 2 sessions of Carter's task force, and not only have we agreed on a list of needs, but he's also gotten everyone to buy into solutions. She paused, then added, that's not to say he hasn't stepped on a few toes in the process. He's demanding and doesn't suffer fools gladly, but I'll take that over people who talk problems to death and never do anything about them. She stopped and looked at her husband. Why do you ask? What have you heard? Mac was reluctant to voice his own misgivings after Colleen's positive take, so all he said was, well, Preston Charlton thinks he's doing a great job. Apparently, Carter's getting a jump on the annual campaign by meeting with big donors in person, and Preston says it's working. See, she said with a smile. I told you he's a go-getter. At the same time, Mac added, curious to see how she'd respond, I gather he's rubbed some of the staff the wrong way. I'm not surprised, Colleen said immediately. I loved Bob Allen, but he acted more like a grandfather than the boss. I like a man who knows what he wants and goes after it. Well, right now, you're looking at a man who wants his dinner, Max said with a laugh, and the two of them headed to the kitchen to prepare a meal that night. Father Mac had the nightmare again. It was the same one that had haunted him off and on for a decade. He and Rico were on overwatch duty in Baghdad. Rico Jimenez was his spotter, and Mac carried the big Barrett M107 sniper rifle. The two men had been paired for 18 months and had grown extremely close. It takes a special chemistry to make a good sniper team, and Mac and Rico were one of the best. An Iraqi sniper had been tormenting their battalion for weeks, firing on them intermittently and causing numerous casualties and several fatalities. After repeated failures to find the sniper, command had decided to fight fire with fire and called in its own sniper team. Mac was lying in the prone position behind a chimney on a rooftop, the barrel of his weapon hidden in shadows. Rico was crouched behind the facade of a building a block away, hoping one of them might spot something and be able to triangulate the shooter's location. They used throat microphones and earbuds to communicate. It was only their second day on watch, but already Mac could tell it was going to be a challenge. No one had had any luck spotting a muzzle flash, as the irregular streets and alleys of Baghdad caused sound to reverberate from multiple directions. As Mac lay there sweating in the late afternoon sun, he could hear the amplified voice of a muezzin in the distance, calling the faithful to prayer. Just then, a gunshot rang out, followed by a scream from somewhere down below. Rico's voice whispered in his ear, "I've got action here, on the street half a block from my position." There was a pause, then Mac heard, "Ah, it's a kid. A little girl, can't be more than 9 or 10 years old. She's been shot in the leg." Another pause. "She's bleeding bad. She's trying to drag herself out of the street, but she can't do it. Damn it, I can see faces in the doorway, but no one will come up to help her." Then Rico's voice got louder. "I'm going down there, Mac. Cover me." "No, wait," Mac implored him. "Let me get help, call in a squad." No time, Rico came back. "She'll bleed to death before they get here. Keep me covered." Quickly, Mac scooted forward as far as he dared and swiveled the scope on the big rifle, searching for the wounded girl while still trying to maintain his own cover. A minute later, he spotted Rico's figure in a doorway. After taking a few moments to check his surroundings, Rico burst out of cover and ran to the little girl's side. He scooped her up in his arms and turned to run back to the building when a second shot rang out. Rico screamed, the sound almost deafening through Mac's earpiece, and through his scope, Mac could see blood spurting from a wound in Rico's thigh. Rico fell heavily, twisting to try to cushion the little girl. "Talk to me. Can you move? Can you get out of there?" Mac yelled. "Son of a, that hurts," came Rico's voice. "I think he hit the bone. I'm stuck, Mac." Adrenaline surged through the tall sniper. "Hang on, compadre. I'll be down in a second," he yelled. "No! Don't move, Mac. Don't you see? It's a trap. He wants you to come out so he can get you too." "No way, man. I'm not leaving you there. Stop, Mac. Stop and think about it. This guy could have killed me easily, but he didn't. He crippled me, Mac. He's using me for bait, just like he used the little girl. Stay put, hermano. Don't give him what he wants." Mac fell back against the facade in despair. He knew his spotter was right, but the idea of leaving him lying in the street was unbearable. "Listen, Rico, just hang in there. We'll get some armor in here to screen you, then pull you out of there quick." "Sure, Mac," Rico said, though his voice sounded unnervingly calm. There was a long pause, then Rico spoke again. "Mac, I want you to do something for me." "Sure, Rico. Anything." "I want you to pray for me." "Rico, I'm not a religious man. I don't know any prayers." "That's okay, Mac. I'll coach you. Just repeat after me." "Rico, why are we doing this?" Mac asked, his voice catching in his throat. "You know why, Mac," came the calm reply. "It won't be long until he figures out you're not coming. Now, I'll go nice and slow, and you repeat what I say. Ready? Our Father, who art in heaven." With tears streaming down his face, Mac repeated the prayer one phrase at a time until he reached, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." That's when the third shot came, silencing Rico forever. Cursing and crying, Mac frantically scanned the surrounding buildings. He felt ashamed that he hadn't spotted the killer, that he hadn't been able to protect Rico. At the same time, he felt guilty for not knowing any prayers to comfort his friend in his last moments. As he lay there in anguish, a fourth shot killed the little girl. Mac sat bolt upright in bed, his face pale, his body covered in a cold sweat. No matter how many times he had that dream, it always shook him to his core. Every time, he felt the same deep emotions. Every time, it made him question whether there was something more he could or should have done. Quietly, he slipped out of bed, being careful not to wake Colleen, and went out to sit in the living room until the shaking subsided enough for him to go back to sleep. When Colleen awoke the next morning, she found the other side of the bed empty. When she went out to the living room to look for him, she was saddened to find her husband asleep on the couch. Mac's bad dreams were common enough occurrences, but she hated that he was still haunted by his experiences in the war. Careful not to wake him, she covered him with a blanket from the closet. She pulled out a silk suit she felt was one of her best outfits. It was a designer label she had found at a thrift store and altered to fit. With an all-day meeting of the United Fund Task Force to attend, she wanted to look professional but smart. Before slipping out of the house, she left a note for Mac, reminding him of her schedule and warning that she might run late this evening. It was Carter Harrison's practice to hold his task force meetings off-site, and this time he had booked a conference room at one of the nicest hotels in town. Colleen would never have dared to do such a thing herself. She felt it was too extravagant, yet she understood the value of getting people to a neutral site, and she appreciated the higher quality of food and service the hotel provided. The session was a long one, and the discussion occasionally became contentious. Through it all, Colleen was impressed by the way Harrison maintained control of the group and kept them on track. At the end of the day, he smoothly summed up their conclusions and then clearly laid out next steps, assigning tasks for follow-up. He must have been a heck of a businessman, she thought admiringly. We're lucky to have him. As the members of the task force began to leave, Harrison walked them out to the hotel lobby, making a point of speaking to each person and thanking them for their participation. When he came to Colleen, however, he leaned over and quietly said, "I want you to stay a little longer. There's something I need to discuss with you." Colleen was caught off guard by his request, but when she tried to ask what he wanted, he stopped her. "This is not a good place for a discussion. The hotel provided me with a room to use for breakout sessions. Here's a key, room 514. Go on up and wait for me there. I'll be along in a few minutes." Then he walked away to speak to another member of their group, leaving Colleen standing there in surprise. After a moment, she dutifully went to the elevator and rode up to the 5th floor. When she opened the door to the room, she found papers and a laptop arranged on the small table. Not wanting to be nosy, she ignored them and sat on the love seat to wait. As time passed, she kept wondering why he wanted to see her. She had to admit that his strong personality made her somewhat uneasy. After what seemed like a long time, she heard a key card in the door and instinctively stood up as Harrison entered the room. Seeing her standing there, he nodded approvingly. Without saying a word, the United Fund executive took off his suit jacket and loosened his tie, then sat down on one corner of the bed, facing her. Colleen started to take a seat on the love seat, but Carter interrupted her, telling her to remain standing. She was startled but complied. "You're a very impressive woman, Colleen," he said after a moment. "As I listened to you today, it was clear that you were the most intelligent person in the group. More importantly, you're a natural leader. Time and again, I saw the others looking to you for direction." Colleen blushed at the unexpected praise. To have someone so accomplished compliment her was extremely gratifying, but when she tried to demur modestly, he stopped her. "No, let me finish." He got up and walked around her, and she felt as though she were being assessed. Then he returned to his seat on the bed. "I can tell you've always been a leader. You're one of those people who are willing to take responsibility for making things happen. At your agency, I imagine your staff leans heavily on you for direction. In fact, I expect that they constantly turn to you to make almost every decision, even on the smallest matters." If you only knew how true that is, Colleen thought to herself. It's a wonder anything gets done when I'm not around. Carter stared directly into her eyes, and she felt as though he could read her thoughts. "But I know your little secret," Carter continued. "I know that all that responsibility can be a terrible burden. It's a constant struggle when everyone else is dependent on you. I know there have been times when you wished you could stop being responsible, when you longed for someone else to make decisions for you." She stared at him in shock. His words were like a key turning in the lock of her mind as she recognized the truth about herself. How could he know that I get so tired of being leaned on? How many times have I secretly wished I didn't have to be responsible? He read her silent response, and the corner of his mouth curled upward momentarily before he continued, "In your heart of hearts, the thing you want is for someone else to take the burden off of you, to turn responsibility over to another. You don't want to be in charge all the time. You want someone else to make decisions. You want to be told what to do, to submit to someone else's will for a change." As Colleen listened to him, she felt as though she was in a trance. He was articulating things she had sensed before but never acknowledged. Now that he had voiced them, she knew he was right. His words seemed to resonate within her, and she felt as though her body was quivering. A need was growing, filling her thoughts and overwhelming her reservations. The desire to submit became a living thing inside her, struggling to come out. Suddenly, he stood up. "Take off your jacket," he instructed. She hesitated, unsure, but his firm tone nudged her to act. After a moment of internal debate, she rationalized that since he had removed his jacket, it was only polite for her to follow suit. She slipped off her jacket and laid it on the love seat, waiting, uncertainty flickering in her mind. He crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Now, remove your blouse," he commanded. Her heart raced, and a moment of hesitation gripped her. She glanced around the room as if searching for an exit. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, but something about his unyielding gaze made her comply. Slowly, she unbuttoned her blouse, her hands trembling slightly. When she finally removed it, she felt an odd combination of discomfort and vulnerability, unsure of what to expect next. He moved closer to her, his gaze still intense. "You want someone else to take charge, don't you?" His voice was low and controlled. She stood there, absorbing his words, feeling a strange recognition stirring inside her. It was as if he had voiced something she had not even acknowledged to herself. Her mind was racing, but his words seemed to have a calming, almost hypnotic effect. As he spoke, she felt a need to surrender, not in a literal sense, but emotionally, to let go of the constant control she held over her life. For once, she wanted to stop being the one making all the decisions. He stepped back, his eyes scanning her face. "Trust me," he said softly. "Let go." The vulnerability she felt became almost palpable, and for a moment, she allowed herself to lean into it. This wasn't about power or control in the way she feared. It was something different, something she hadn't quite figured out yet. After what felt like an eternity, he walked to the other side of the room, leaving her standing in the quiet aftermath of the moment. She was left questioning herself, caught between relief and confusion. When he left the room, he did so without ceremony, gathering his things as if the meeting had ended. Colleen stood frozen for a moment, then slowly moved to the bathroom, staring into the mirror. Her reflection felt foreign, as if she were looking at someone else. As she tried to fix her makeup and hair, the same question echoed in her mind. Who am I? What just happened? She didn't have the answers yet, but she knew something had shifted inside her. Finally satisfied that she had done all she could to make her appearance normal, she prepared to leave. After retrieving her purse, she walked to the door, opened it cautiously, and peeked out to see if anyone was in the hallway. When she saw it was clear, she hurriedly closed the door behind her and scurried to the elevators. As she was waiting, a maid emerged from a room, pushing a cleaning cart. As she passed Colleen, she gave her a strange look. Oh God, Colleen thought, I wonder if she heard us. Thankfully, the elevator door opened at that moment, and Colleen hurried inside. Colleen drove home in a daze, her mind filled with images of what had just happened at the hotel. How could I have done that? She kept asking herself. Why didn't I stop him? The embarrassment of standing naked in front of a fully clothed Carter haunted her. The picture of her compliant body draped over the love seat tortured her. But what bothered her most was the way she had responded to the entire experience. She couldn't believe how she had acted, but she couldn't deny the levels of excitement she had reached. As she drove into their neighborhood, her attention shifted to Mac, and she was filled with guilt. I just committed adultery, she thought in horror. Oh God, I can't believe I cheated on Mac. I love him so much. How could I do that to him? Knowing she would have to face him soon filled her with dread. He'll know right away what I've done, she imagined, and she began to cry in self-pity. But as she neared the house, she angrily wiped the tears from her cheeks. It's a little too late for those now, she told herself. Yet when she went in and found that Mac had already prepared dinner for them, she began to panic. The idea of sitting across the table from him after what she had just done was more than she could bear. Honey, I don't feel very well, she told him. My throat is sore, and I think I might be coming down with something. I'm going to skip dinner, get in bed, and see if a good night's sleep will help me fight this off. Mac was concerned, but she assured him she would be all right and urged him not to let his dinner get cold. When he finally went back to the table, she slipped off to the bedroom, closed the door, got undressed, and climbed into bed. When Mac came to check on her later, she pretended to be asleep, but her guilt kept her awake for a long time. The next morning, Mac awoke before Colleen and decided to let her sleep in. It won't hurt for her to be a little late. Heck, if she's coming down with something, she needs to stay home all day. They can manage without her for once. But he was surprised to get a call at the rectory from Colleen before noon. She told him that a night's sleep had done her a world of good and she felt up to going into work. Max smiled to himself. She's always so responsible. Wouldn't think about missing a day of work. 2 days later, Mac was working on his sermon in his office when Mrs. Moore, a widow in the congregation who volunteered as church secretary, buzzed him. There's a Mr. Harrison here who'd like to see you. He says he knows you. Oh yes, Carter Harrison. Please send him in. When Mrs. Moore showed Harrison in, Mac rose to shake the man's hand. This is a surprise, Carter. What can I do for you? Are things going well at the United Fund? Everything's fine there, but I'm not here on United Fund business, Father Mac. This is more of a personal matter. I see. Let me just close the door so we won't be disturbed. Now, what did you want to discuss? Father Mac, what is the Episcopal Church's position on confession? Harrison asked. Mac was startled but tried not to show it. Well, the confession of sins is an integral part of our worship. Since we are all sinners, the entire congregation makes a general confession as part of the Eucharist, morning prayer, and other services. But what about the private confession of sins by an individual? Does the Episcopal Church do that? Harrison pressed. We do sometimes, Father Mac conceded, but it's not very common. Unlike our Roman Catholic brethren, we don't have a confessional or anything like that. But I have heard a few confessions when a parishioner felt it would be of help to them. I see, Harrison nodded. I've also heard that confessions are strictly confidential, that a priest can never discuss what he hears in a confession with anyone else. Is that really true? What you're talking about is called the seal of confession. Put simply, that means that any sin confessed to a priest must be held in strict confidence. The priest must maintain that confidence under all circumstances, even after the death of the person who made the confession. Mac paused and looked at Harrison carefully. Carter, are you here to make a confession? Yes, Father Mac. I think I'd like to do that. So what do we do next? You said there was no confession box here. Do we go into the sanctuary? Mac smiled. We believe where a confession is made is irrelevant. St. Anne's is a relatively low church, and I prefer to keep things nearly informal. The few times I've heard a personal confession, I've done it in my office. We're less likely to be disturbed that way. That's good, Harrison agreed. I definitely want to keep this just between you and me. Very well, Mac said. We can get started. When I've heard confessions before, the person seeking it had done something that weighed heavily on his or her conscience, and they were looking for absolution to ease that burden. Is that how you feel? Oh yes, Harrison agreed quickly. All right then, what is it you wish to confess? Harrison leaned toward Father Mac and stared intently at him. I want to confess the sin of adultery, he said in a clear voice. Father Mac hesitated. I don't understand, Carter. I thought that you were divorced. Father Mac said, and then caught himself. Oh, I see. You mean that you had sexual relations with a married woman? That's right, Harrison said. I seduced another man's wife. He then gave a half-smile. Do you want me to tell you the name of the woman? No, Father Mac said, not if you don't want to. I'd rather not, Father, because you know her. The thought that an acquaintance was involved saddened Father Mac, but he put that aside to focus on the man before him. Harrison's tone seemed almost smug, which irritated Father Mac. If you knew it was wrong, why did you do it? He asked sharply. Oh, the usual reasons, I guess, Harrison said casually. I could tell that she was interested, and I guess I just couldn't resist the temptation. Father Mac looked at Harrison, wondering if the man was making some kind of joke. Carter, I have to say that for a man making a confession, you don't seem very remorseful. Oh no, Father, I did a terrible thing to that woman, and I know it, Harrison said. Father Mac decided to let it go. Very well. Is there anything else you need to confess? No, Father, just one serious sin for today. So what do I do now? Say some prayers? The flippant tone of voice was still there, but Father Mac decided not to call Harrison on it. You can if you wish, but I'd rather you spend some time reflecting on what you've done and the harm it can cause to everyone involved, not the least to yourself. He picked up a copy of the Book of Common Prayer and handed it to the man. I'd also like you to find some quiet time and turn to the service of the Holy Eucharist. Find the General Confession of Sin, read it, and then incorporate it into your own prayers. And you ought to go to your Bible and refresh yourself on the 10 Commandments, especially the 7th. Harrison took the book from Father Mac and nodded. Then he smiled at the priest and stood up. I'm glad I did this, Father Mac. I feel so much better." With that, he turned and left. Father Mac returned to his desk and tried to make sense of what had just happened. He was surprised that Harrison had sought him out in the first place. Mac had never seen him at St. Anne's before, and as far as he knew, the man didn't attend church anywhere else. His request for confession was an even greater surprise. But Father Mac had seen enough of humanity to know how unpredictable any given individual could be. At the same time, he was disappointed to learn what Harrison had done. All people are fallible, as Mac knew full well, but he still felt that someone in Harrison's position had a special obligation to act responsibly. He wondered what repercussions Harrison's actions might have on the people involved and, worse, if it could adversely impact the United Fund itself. He fervently hoped that Harrison wasn't involved with one of his employees or an employee's spouse, as that could tear apart the whole organization. Why can't people think with their minds rather than their impulses? He thought regretfully. But beyond these considerations, what kept nagging at Mac was the disconnect between what Harrison said he wanted and his attitude. Why would he want to confess his actions if he wasn't serious? Father Mac asked himself if Harrison was truly penitent. Why didn't he act like it? All these concerns made him wish he could discuss them with someone else, but he knew he could never share what he had learned with anyone. The burden was solely on his shoulders. Sometimes being a priest isn't as fulfilling as it's made out to be, he thought ruefully. The next few days proved trying for Colleen. At work, she found herself frequently distracted, so much so that several of her staff members asked if she was feeling well. At home, she had trouble sleeping, and when she did manage to drop off, her dreams were troubling. Twice she woke up to find herself in an uncomfortable position. Even worse, she felt distant from Mac, which frightened her. Mac had always been exactly what Colleen had wanted, a loving and caring man who was always there for her. So why was it that now she felt she needed something else? Finally, at the end of a long and difficult day, she picked up the phone and made a call. She was almost trembling while she waited for an answer. When the secretary put her through, Carter Harrison answered smoothly. "Good afternoon, Miss O'Reilly. What can I do for you today?" Colleen's throat tightened, and her mouth went dry. She forced herself to speak, but her voice came out as a whisper. "Carter, I need to see you again." There was a brief silence on the line, and then his voice came through with a tone that made her think of snakes. "Would you repeat that, please, Miss O'Reilly?" She realized he had heard her the first time. Nevertheless, she swallowed and tried again. "Mr. Harrison, sir, I need to see you again. I really need you." When she heard him laugh, she shuddered. The weekends were always busy for Father Mac. Inevitably, there were last-minute preparations for Sunday services, a final edit to his sermon, calls about floral arrangements, and last-minute notices from the parents of acolytes. The list seemed endless. So when Colleen told him on Friday that she would need to go into work on Saturday afternoon, Mac was actually relieved. When she was at home, he felt an obligation to give her his attention, and on Saturdays like this one, that would be difficult if not impossible. When she returned home later that evening, Mac was shocked by Colleen's appearance. Her face was drawn, and she seemed stiff and achy. Once, when she sat down too quickly on the couch, she winced. He asked what was wrong, but she dismissed his concerns. "I think my period may be coming early this month, that's all," she told him. Once again, she went to bed early without eating anything, and Mac made a mental note to insist she see her doctor for a checkup. On Sunday, she didn't feel up to attending either morning prayer or mass, which only fueled Mac's concern. After the last parishioner had left the parking lot at St. Anne's, Mac hurried home, stopping only to pick up some fast food that he knew Colleen liked. When he got there, he was greatly relieved to find his wife up and about. The color in her face had returned, and she told him that a hot shower and a couple of aspirin had taken care of her discomfort. When he brought up the idea of a medical checkup, she dismissed it. It was probably nothing more than a 24-hour bug, she said. I'm fine now. Mac was convinced enough of her recovery to attend the meeting scheduled for that evening, but he couldn't stop worrying entirely. Colleen had always been so strong, the thought of something being wrong with her was deeply disturbing. What would I do without her? He wondered as he drove over to the church. He recalled the first time he'd met Colleen. The Marines had sent him home following his breakdown, and still struggling to cope with everything that had happened, he decided to use the GI Bill to attend divinity school. It was there that he had his first nightmare, which unsettled him so much that he went to student health in the middle of the night. That was where he met Colleen. He had been waiting to see a doctor, and she was waiting for a friend who had gotten food poisoning. The two of them started talking, and after a while, Mac decided he didn't need to see a doctor after all. The caring social work student had listened to his story and calmed him with her quiet concern. She, in turn, was intrigued by this gentleman who, despite the horrors of war, felt a calling for something greater than himself. A week later, they ran into each other on campus again, and Mac took the opportunity to get her number. Soon, they were seeing each other regularly, and in their senior year, they were married in the divinity school chapel. She had been there for him ever since. If weekends were hectic for Mac, Mondays tended to be slower. He was tidying up his desk to go home that afternoon when Mrs. Moore buzzed him. "That nice Mr. Harrison is back to see you, Father Mac," she said. "Shall I show him in?" With all his concern about Colleen, the mystery of Carter Harrison had completely slipped Mac's mind. Now, here he was again. He sighed and asked Mrs. Moore to bring Harrison back to the office. After she had done so, she reminded him that she was leaving for the day. After thanking her and wishing her a good evening, Father Mac turned back to his visitor. "Hello, Carter. I hope your visit today is for a different reason than last time." Harrison gave him a solemn look. "I'm afraid not, Father Mac. I have a new sin to confess. I committed adultery with the same woman again." Mac looked at him suspiciously, trying to understand the man's motives. "Are you sure you're not making this up, Carter?" he asked. "Oh no, Father, it's all true. Why would I make up such a thing? If it's true, then I'm very disappointed in you, Carter. I had hoped that when you came to confess, you were truly remorseful. But repeating the same sin is hardly a sign of repentance. Forget about yourself for a minute and think about what you're doing to this woman and her family." "I do think about that, Father, and I'm very aware of where my actions could lead. But I don't think I'm entirely to blame this time. She came on to me. She told me that she needed me desperately, that I unlocked something inside her she didn't know she had. Carter, I don't want to hear about your sexual prowess or how this woman can't live without you. The purpose of confession is to admit your sins and dedicate yourself to living a better life. If you can't do that, then I can't help you. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Father." "I'm afraid I'm only human," Harrison said as he stood up and headed for the door. As he reached for the doorknob, he turned to look back at the priest. "But I can tell you one thing, talking to you about this has made me feel a whole lot better." Mac stared at him as Harrison left and then began to pace angrily around his tiny office. He felt as though he were the butt of some practical joke he didn't understand. What was that all about? Is he angry with the church? Is he trying to undermine it by mocking the sacraments? Is he making this up to make me look foolish, or could he sincerely be regretful but just doesn't know how to express it? Whatever is going on, I don't get it, and I don't like it. If Harrison was playing some sort of game, Mac admitted he couldn't be sure. It was a game he didn't want to play. There were real people in his congregation and in his community who needed help and sought spiritual comfort. Those were the people Mac became a priest to serve, not Carter Harrison, whoever he was. Above all, what bothered Mac the most were the implications for the United Fund. Mac had been active in the organization for many years and felt it played a vital role in the community. It needed a leader with vision and compassion, not someone who wants to waste time playing games with a parish priest, he thought angrily. He felt he should alert Preston Charlton or someone else on the United Fund Board of Trustees about his concerns regarding Harrison, but he saw no way to do so without mentioning the man's confessions. It was a dilemma for which Mac had no solution. While Mac was wrestling with his dilemma, his wife was dealing with one of her own. Ever since her first encounter with Carter Harrison, Colleen's conscience had been troubling her for her betrayal of Mac. Her husband was the best man she had ever met. Not only was he devoted to his congregation and community, but she knew for certain that he was devoted to her. Yet Harrison had somehow managed to tempt her to cheat. He had introduced her to sensations she had never experienced before, and now she felt like she was hooked, craving more. One moment she would chastise herself for her weakness and vow to sever ties with Carter forever. The next moment, she would find herself replaying their encounters in her mind and longing for more. She despised the man but felt a desperate need for him. Struggling to resist contacting him again, she was caught off guard by her phone ringing while sitting at her desk, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. When she answered, she was surprised to hear Carter Harrison's voice. He skipped the pleasantries, his tone blunt and commanding. "Make an excuse to your husband. You're going to meet me at the beach this weekend. Leave before noon on Saturday and drive straight to the Royal Sands Hotel. Don't bring any extra clothes." "But," Colleen stuttered. "You heard me." "Just do it," Harrison interrupted, and then abruptly hung up. That evening, when Matt came home, Colleen could sense that something was troubling him. She had always been able to read him well, but when she asked him about it, he brushed off her concerns. "It's nothing important, just a minor issue with one of the parishioners." Not wanting to press further, Colleen decided to address her own situation. "Is it okay if I go out of town this weekend? My sister called and asked me to visit." "There's nothing wrong with Megan, is there?" "No, it's fine," Mac replied. "Send her my regards." That night, Mac had difficulty falling asleep, his thoughts still tangled with his encounter with Carter Harrison. He resolved to visit the United Fund the next morning to gather more information and understand the situation better. This decision helped him relax enough to finally get some rest. Colleen also struggled to sleep, and Carter Harrison was at the center of her restless thoughts. The urge to submit to him and experience the thrill of his dominance was something she felt she couldn't resist. She lay in bed, trying to rationalize her behavior, telling herself it was just a temporary diversion. A few moments later, she began to worry that she might be addicted to these encounters. If it was an illness, she thought, then perhaps she wasn't fully accountable for her actions. But as someone who dealt with people who rationalized their behavior at the women's shelter, she felt hypocritical for using such excuses for herself. Defensive, she convinced herself that Mac's role in the church and community put an unfair level of pressure on her. "It's not fair to expect me to be perfect all the time," she thought. "Besides, Mac is too nice, too considerate. Sometimes I feel overwhelmed." Yet, she knew she had married him knowing what kind of man he was, and it was those very qualities that had initially attracted her to him. What hurt the most was knowing how much Mac needed her. When she had met him, she had found a man grappling with the aftermath of war. Her most vivid memory was the night he had broken down and shared the story of his best friend's death. Although his story had frightened her, especially because she couldn't reconcile his gentleness with his past, she knew he was telling the truth. She was impressed that despite his struggles, he had chosen to seek healing through divinity school. She took pride in helping him rebuild his life and earn respect in the community, even as he maintained his modest demeanor. However, she also knew he still faced challenges, relying on her strength and support as a safeguard against any threats to his stability. This made her feel profoundly ashamed of her actions, as she was not only breaking her vows but also jeopardizing the well-being of a man who depended on her. If Mac had checked his wife's pillowcase the next morning, he would have found it damp. Once he arrived at his office at St. Anne's, Father Mac called Bill Simpson at the United Fund and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. The story continues in the next video. Link to part 2 in the description of this video. Thank you for watching and for your likes.